De nuevo, muchas gracias a todos por estar aquí en el día de hoy. Vamos a dar comienzo al primer panel sobre acceso abierto. El panel va a estar formado por el profesor Robert Gallamore y por los ingenieros Alejandro Pablo Baroso y el ingeniero Ricardo Langer. Va a comenzar Robert Gallamore. Muchos de ustedes creo que ya lo conocen. Ya es un amigo de la Argentina. Hemos tenido la oportunidad de visitar los Estados Unidos en un intercambio de técnico con las autoridades ferroviarias de los Estados Unidos, oportunidad en la que estuvo Robert Gallamore con un equipo de la Universidad del Estado de Michigan, y el año pasado nos visitó también y formó parte de los expositores en unas jornadas que realizamos por el mes de junio del año pasado, y hoy ha estado 2 días con un equipo nuestro de gente de los distintos organismos y empresas dependientes del Estado Nacional en materia ferroviaria, también dando unas charlas con respecto al sistema ferroviario norteamericano. Robert Gallamore es PhD de Harvard University, forma parte de Gallamore Group, es una consultora, es profesor de Michigan State University, la universidad estatal del estado de Michigan. Básicamente lo que hace es dar los cursos de administración ferroviaria para esa universidad. Es autor de un libro ya muy conocido, que creo que las ventas andan muy bien, que se llama Ferrocarriles Norteamericanos. Es básicamente la historia de los ferrocarriles norteamericanos desde su nacimiento, su declinación y luego su renacimiento. Así que bueno, le damos la palabra a Robert y muchísimas gracias por visitarnos otra vez en la Argentina.
Gracias, Juan. Buenos días, everyone. I am so pleased to be here back in Buenos Aires and in Argentina to speak with you today about my favorite topic, which is ferrocarril, railroads. Some of you I've seen before, I've met before, and I just enjoyed the remarks of Senor Barrido so much because technology is one of my favorite things, and I will comment as I go through my presentation on some of the points he made so well. So this is my book. It's available, and I would be happy to sign it for you if you have a copy. I enjoyed working on this book with my mentor, whose picture is here. Can you see? Can everyone see that? My mentor is John Meyer, who unfortunately passed away a few years ago, but he was my co-author as well as my faculty advisor at Harvard. So there he is, a wonderful man. I'm going to speak both about freight railroads and later passenger railroads in the United States today. And if you have questions later, I will be happy to respond to them as I can, or later by email. And I'll leave with you my email address for that purpose. So this is a double-stack train. It's on the Burlington Northern Santa Fe, and that's a railroad, private railroad in America, owned by Warren Buffett. Is that name familiar? One of the world's richest people, and a competitor of the railroad I worked for, which is Union Pacific. I'll show you those railroads briefly on this map. These are the New York Stock Exchange symbols for the large railroads. And I think I can do this. Yes. This one's the Burlington Northern. So everything that's in green on this map is Burlington Northern, and my railroad is in purple, Union Pacific. We have 4 very large Class 1 railroads, we call them, the largest railroads in America. And there are 2 in Canada, Canadian Pacific and Canadian National. And the Kansas City Southern, KSU, is the one in black on this map, and it is also a Class 1 railroad, but smaller than what we call the Big Four, which are Burlington Northern, Union Pacific, CSX, and Norfolk Southern. You won't be able to see this chart well, but I can tell you what it means. I have tried to graph on one chart all of American railroad history over the 20th century, so you can imagine it's a very messy chart. But what it says is that we have been able in the USA, particularly since deregulation, to improve our performance. Deregulation, we relate to the Staggers Rail Act of 1980. So for the last 30 years, 35 years, we have had much better performance of our railroads. And so today, at the end of this chart, yes, you can see it, measured in ton miles, or you could translate that to ton kilometers, we have 12 times the amount of volume, freight volume, that we did in 1900, that is the beginning of the 20th century. So this line, this heavy line, goes from an index of what it was in 1900 to today, and that is a growth of 12 times, 12-fold growth in volume, ton miles. At the same time, we have done that with only 1/6 the employment. So this is a good thing and a bad thing. It is good in that we are very productive. We're able to move many ton miles with many fewer employees. On the other hand, it means the employment in the industry, somebody had to either lose their jobs or retire. And that's an issue that has been with us for all of this time. The employees who lose their jobs, usually in the United States, have some form of benefits. They are protected, we say, for a period of time, probably 6 years in most cases. Or they have been paid to leave their jobs, which is expensive for the railroad to do, but solves, in a way, not fully solves, the problem of the employees not having their paycheck anymore. You understand the trade-offs that have had to be made in that regard. I wanted to show you just briefly what the experience of our entire freight industry has been. On this chart, railroads are the red part at the bottom, and you can see that the share of ton miles, has declined relatively to the other modes, and most of the growth has been in trucks, relatively speaking. So the ton miles are still important. I think about 42% of freight ton miles in America are still operated by railroads, and smaller amounts, but a growing amount, operated by trucks over the interstate highways. We call them big rigs or 18-wheelers, big heavy trucks that you see on the roads. In this chart, I tried again for the whole period of the 20th century. This is the first half of the 20th century, from 1900 to mid-century, 1956. Different measures of performance by the railroad industry. And I show this to you only to show you what you already imagine or know, that some of these statistics are heavily influenced by the state of the macroeconomy, by gross domestic product. And so during wartime, our railroads have been very productive because they have hauled a lot of the war material and the troops that have had to go overseas in wars, World War I or World War II or Vietnam War. Over the period of this chart, which is ends a decade after World War II, you can see that there has been a large increase in the amount of total traffic, and you can see that revenues and rates have also grown over that period. Here's the important fact, though, or factors about regulation and deregulation, summarized again on one chart. A little messy, but you can see from this chart that when railroads were deregulated in 1980 with the Staggers Act, after that period, productivity really increased rapidly, particularly in the first part of the period between 1980 and the turn of the 21st century. So the top line, the red line, shows productivity improvement calculated as you would expect with output divided by the input factors of fuel and labor hours and investment dollars into the development and purchase of equipment. Over that same period, the volume increased again quite rapidly, and revenues, however, didn't increase so much, and that is because deregulation caused or allowed the reduction of rates for moving freight. This is the key factor. I call it rates on this chart. It's really a mix of changes in traffic types and the amount that is charged for moving freight cars. So the effect of deregulation was surprisingly, much to everybody's shock, was to lower the costs of operating railroads, lower the rates that customers, shippers had to pay. Really a remarkable factor. You can see this on the chart. So with the rates coming down, that in effect diluted the total revenues. We didn't need as much revenue to enable the traffic to move and to pay the railroads for their work. That's because they were vastly more productive. We've had a lot of growth in certain commodities. One of the ones I like to mention is PRB coal. Sorry for the abbreviation. It means Powder River Basin coal. That's in Wyoming, huge open pit mines, strip mined coal. It's very low quality coal, but very easy to mine because it occurs in huge seams. Maybe 100 feet, that would be what, 30 to 40 meters thick, the coal appears. And it's hauled very long distances, in some cases over 1,000 miles, 1,500 kilometers in some cases. So it's inexpensive to move it. It has low BTUs, so we move a lot of it to make the amount of energy necessary to burn in our electricity generating power plants. This wouldn't have happened without the ability to make long-term contracts between the power plants for the supply of coal to them and for the movement of the coal by railroads to them. So the important fact is that the Staggers Act enabled these contracts to be written for the movement of the coal and other commodities. That was impossible before. It was illegal to have a contract between a customer and a shipper before 1980. A surprising fact, perhaps, but that's what opened the floodgates and allowed the traffic to begin moving much cheaper and much more at a lower rate and much greater volumes. So the important fact is that we permitted long-term rate and service contracts to be entered into, negotiated between the railroads and their customers. These contracts might have been for a whole train load. before 1980, the rate would have been based on simple carloads. So one car of moving coal from Wyoming to Kansas City might have cost $2,000, let me say. After deregulation, there wouldn't be just the movement or the rate for one car. It would be for a whole train, a unit train, and the effective rate would have been half what it was before. So instead of $1,000, or did I say $2,000, for a carload of coal to move, it would be half that, $500 to $1,000. What I'm saying is that deregulation allowed a change in the very economics of how we operated our railroads. Instead of moving on public tariffs, a tariff is a published rate for a movement. The traffic would move based on a contract. These contracts are filed with the regulatory authorities, but they are secret. So nobody knows for sure how much the railroad had to pay. In the old days, that would have been totally illegal. They had to be public, and they had to be published, but that was cumbersome, and those rates were not changed quickly enough to adapt to supply and demand. Really important factor is that deregulation through contracts allowed railroads and customers to match supply and demand. Makes sense to an economist for sure. Technology came along with the necessary investments that then had to be made. I like to make the point that the technology, Senor Barudo was mentioning, we capture that new technology in these contracts and in the capital investments that the railroads make. The technology doesn't just show up automatically. Well, yes, it does. It shows up in the new investment. So if we are reinvesting in the railroad, buying new locomotives, those new locomotives have the new technology already embedded in them. They are more efficient at burning fuel. They have lower emissions. They have fancy electronic gizmos in them to help the train perform better, and so on. With respect to the track, the rail itself the new rail embodies better steel than it used to. So the fact here, the point I'm trying to make, is that the technology comes along with the capital investments. Deregulation allowed the railroads to reinvest in a way they couldn't before, and when they reinvested, the new technology came with it. I did want to mention one additional type of technology. Again, apropos of Senor Barudo's comments, he mentioned hydrogen as a fuel. That's possible. Fuel cell could be, a bank of fuel cells could be put into locomotives. I think more likely in the near term is the use of natural gas as a fuel for locomotives. We in America are blessed these days by having new supplies of petroleum, oil, and gas that have come from fracking. The term fracking might mean something to you, I hope so. So in deposits of shale, we break them apart, and that allows the natural gas to emerge and be pumped to the surface. So we are now a country that has an abundance of natural gas, whereas 10 years ago we were afraid we were running out. Same with oil. 10 years ago we were importing huge amounts of petroleum from the Middle East. And now we are almost self-sufficient in the production of petroleum. The fun thing, the interesting thing for our railroads today is that traffic in moving crude oil, which always in the past was strictly by pipelines, we are now carrying by rail, And the reason for it is that the refineries are located very far from where the oil and gas are produced. And they just don't happen to be pipelines serving those particular origins and destinations. The railroad allows the petroleum industry to move the newly originated oil from fracking by tank car, and they can move it to a variety of refineries located either on the Atlantic coast or the Gulf Coast, depending on demand. So it's worked out very well. There is one downside, and that is that there have been some very serious accidents from moving this oil. I think the problem was that the petroleum industry did not realize how volatile that oil from fracking is. It has a lot of dangerous chemicals that come along with the crude oil. And so now there's a big requirement to not only use safer tank cars, but to maybe pre-process the petroleum from underground before putting it into the tank cars, making it less volatile. I mentioned new investments incorporating technology, but they also incorporate labor-saving and safety enhancements, and that yields higher returns on investment and makes our railroad safer. So we've come upon, because of deregulation, a virtuous spiral. Deregulation allowed productivity increases. You saw that on the chart. It has produced stronger cash flows. The cash flows have enabled the railroads to pay for new capital goods, reinvest in their plants. Along with the new investments comes new technology. It's deployed. It improves safety. It allows us to carry more traffic. It increases capacity. And fortunately, it's also profitable. So our railroads have never been as prosperous as they are now because of this virtuous cycle. Make sense? Yeah. I'm not going to try to go through this in detail. Juan would elbow me and tell me I'm taking up too much time. But it is a fact that railroads are multi-product firms with economies of density that enables them to be very efficient, but they must charge prices higher than their marginal costs or they'll go bankrupt. This has brought about a proposal for us to make the railroads less monopolistic, provide more competition between railroads by allowing competitive access. That's the title of this panel, open access. Competitive access probably would directly lower the rates, so naturally our railroads aren't very happy about this and don't favor it. They recognize that they will have to, in some cases though, make bargains with their customers that would lower rates, or if they want to merge and become larger railroads, even larger than they already are, they will have to make concessions such as allowing a competitor to use their tracks. In the American system of government, however, there's going to be huge legal battles over this. Railroads do not want to give away their private property rights. They want to be compensated for it. And the U.S. Constitution says you must be compensated if you take property from the railroads. So we are in the midst of this battle today. Congress is trying to decide whether it will require the railroads to increase the amount of competitive access through something called reciprocal switching. And I'll show you just a slide or two to give you the idea of what we mean by reciprocal switching. I'm very aware that I'm running out of time, And I will therefore skip through some of these slides, but you will have them with you, and I think they will be understandable to you. So the key concept behind open access in America is that a shipper which has only one railroad serving him may want to have a second railroad, and there may be arrangements for that required. So just using this simple diagram, I can give you the idea of it. On this diagram, between points A and B, there's only one railroad. Between B and C, there are two. What we would require in reciprocal switching is that Railroad A switch the cars, that is, provide the service of switching to a plant on behalf of its competitor railroad over its own tracks. It's this part of it that's over its own tracks that causes the legal problem, the constitutional problem under our system. So here's how I've tried to draw it. At location A, there's these little spidery red lines are service provided by switching by railroad number 1 on behalf of railroad number 2, if you can see the chart. Now, reciprocal means I do it for you here, you do it for me there. And that works out reasonably well. It happens all the time in our industries. The problem today is that to add competitive access, open access, you have to force Railroad 1 to handle the cars for Railroad 2 because it isn't really reciprocal. There's no other way for it to be balanced. And so it has to be done on the basis of a fee, of a payment to make things supply and demand equal. That's the problem. We have to invent a method for charging Railroad 2 to have its cars moved by Railroad 1. And there's no economic theory that tells you how to do that. There's no way to spread the joint common costs that are incurred by Railroad 1 on behalf of Railroad 2. There's no fair way to do it. That's what my book's all about, and that's our problem today. That's why the lawyers in Washington are fighting over this, and that's the kind of issue that will be raised for as we try to increase the amount of open access and competition that we have. Should I quit?
No, you have 5 more minutes.
I have 5 minutes in which to finish. So naturally, I'm going to do this very quickly, and I do want to say some things about passengers, so I will do it. The only economic theory that we have been able to come up with as to how ideally these charges should be levied is something called the hypothetical standalone railroad cost methodology. And if anybody is interested in digging into the weeds on this topic, I'll be happy to share papers or discuss it with you. It's theoretical, it's hypothetical, and nobody knows how it's going to be worked out. It's a big black box. Oh, well, I'm not going to have a chance to go through this. This is fun stuff, right? This is really what we economists love to do, is draw lines on charts. The only point of this chart I want to leave with you is that it really matters where we are on the cost curve. So this is a railroad with declining costs, and if we're in this half of the chart, we have a recommendation that we should use something called Ramsey pricing in order to set the rates. But if it is that we're on this part of the chart where rates are where capacity is constrained and where costs are increasing, where there's congestion, then we want to use something called congestion pricing. Again, can't get into it now, but that's the dilemma that we face and will never be solved in pure theory. It will only be resolved in practice by negotiation. So I do want to say just a few things about our passenger system before I leave you, and mention to you that in the past, we're operating our passenger trains on freight railroads. This is a snapshot taken in 1962. The freight railroads provided passenger service at that time. The red lines simply mean that that's the more dense part of the network, and it covers what's now the Northeast Corridor, and you can see the Northeast Corridor in red on this map. So when Amtrak was formed and started up in 1971, the amount of passenger service was cut drastically from that big spaghetti map before to this simple system after. Today, Amtrak looks something like this. The best service is in the Northeast Corridor, and in the rest of the country, the Amtrak operates over freight railroads. So I bring this up in part because our theme today is open access. Amtrak has access to the freight railroads by law. The freight railroads are required to move Amtrak trains. And once again, what's the problem? It's how much do they have to pay for that privilege? And economic theory gives you almost nothing to guide you in that enterprise. This chart simply says that in the Northeast Corridor, things are different because Amtrak happens to own the tracks for their operation in the Northeast, but in the rest of the country, they don't. And so an agreement has to be written and payment has to be made from Amtrak to the freight railroads to operate those trains. Only in the Northeast Corridor are Amtrak trains profitable. What this chart shows is the Acceso chart, the green up at the top, is where our passenger trains make money. The rest of the country, they're huge losers, and this is the problem we face in terms of taxpayers paying for Amtrak's operation. It costs taxpayers about $1 billion a year to provide this, and most of it is outside the Northeast Corridor. This just quickly says, what did we achieve with Amtrak? And did we succeed or fail? The bottom line is we haven't used Amtrak to solve the transportation issue, and we do have to pay a lot of taxpayer money to support it. But we have saved some of the essential service, such as in the Northeast Corridor. I'll leave you with this is the problem of the railroads, right? This was a muckraker 130 years ago, and he labeled the railroads the octopus because what does the octopus do? It gathers everything and squeezes the life out of them. And I say, no, that's not what we have. Instead, we have freight railroads that in the U.S. today are profitable and needed, and that's a wonderful thing. My takeaways, I won't go through this, but my takeaways are simply that our railroads have survived. They have come through some terrible times because of deregulation. They've been able to reinvest, and with that, they have become more technologically sophisticated and are able to earn good revenue. And the country, the customers, the labor unions, everyone is much better off because of this happy scenario. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with you.